They entered the tower as princes, one to be king, the other to stand beside him. Two boys with blood pure enough to rule, hearts too young to fear what lurked behind stone walls. The doors closed behind them. The windows were too high to cry through. The guards, once loyal to their father, now served a crown that no longer belonged to a child. And then they vanished. No screams, no blood, no funeral, just absence. One day they were seen playing together in the courtyard, the elder with a regal bearing far beyond his 12 years, the younger never letting go of his brother's hand. The next, their rooms were quiet, their beds untouched. Their names were no longer spoken at court. The crown had passed, quietly, violently, to someone else, and the princes, forgotten or buried, or worse, remembered in secret by the man who might have ordered their deaths. Some said their uncle, Richard, silenced them to claim the throne. Others whispered of betrayal from the shadows, of rival claimants who needed them dead to survive. But none of it was proven. No trial, no charges. Just two boys swallowed whole by a kingdom that valued silence more than truth. The Tower of London stands to this day, cold, still, watching. Some believe the boys never left, that their footsteps echo in the stone, night after night, never finding a door that opens. What is a royal lineage worth if it devours its own children? Edward was only 12, Richard was 9. And after their father's death, the only thing between them and the throne was family. A kingdom without a king is a body without a heart, and when Edward IV collapsed, the crown lost its pulse. His sudden death in the spring of 1483 sent shock through the veins of England, but not everyone mourned. Because behind every royal funeral lies a scramble for power, and his sons, Edward and Richard, were too young to protect what was already slipping from their hands. The elder boy, Edward, was named king within days. But he had no sword, no army, and no voice that the council truly obeyed. He was only 12. The throne beneath him was carved from oak, but it might as well have been ice. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, moved quickly to shield him, surrounding him with her family, the Woodvilles, an ambitious clan hated by half the nobility. She ordered him brought to London, but not into the Tower. Not yet. Not until it was too late, because another man was already moving. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's brother, a seasoned general, a man whispered to be loyal until he was. He intercepted young Edward on the road, smiling, bowing, swearing protection, and then calmly, carefully began removing every Woodville from the boy's side. Arrested, executed, banished. In less than a fortnight, the child king had no one left. No mother, no uncle, no council, only Richard. By June, Richard had brought both Edward and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, into the Tower of London. Not as captives, not officially. No, only to prepare for the coronation, he said. To protect them, he insisted. The words were soft, the gates were iron, and somewhere inside, the boys were still smiling, still trusting, still waiting. But the crown never touched Edward's head, because before the bells could ring, someone declared him illegitimate, not a rightful son. Not a rightful king. Parliament followed, the church nodded, and Richard, no longer just the Duke, walked to Westminster Abbey as the crowned King of England. The princes remained in the Tower, but no longer as guests. A crown stolen in daylight rarely needs blood. It only needs silence, and Richard knew that better than anyone. With the princes locked within the tower and the court reshaped by fear, England exhaled under a new king, Richard III. Protector turned monarch, uncle turned sovereign, but the tower did not open its gates. The boys were still inside, and each passing day grew quieter. At first, it was said they still walked the inner yard. That Edward, thin and pale, watched the ravens with solemn eyes, and Richard, just 9, followed him like a shadow. They asked no questions, they trusted, they waited. But waiting inside the tower was not a pause, it was a sentence. And the walls began to forget their names. Outside, the streets whispered. Had they fallen ill? Had they been moved? No guards gave answers, no ministers asked. Richard's regime was swift, cold, and strangely calm. Every protester vanished behind closed doors. Those who once claimed loyalty to the princes now dined beside their usurper. Those who doubted the new king now remembered loyalty, conveniently, fearfully. One man, the Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's closest ally, began to shift. He had helped destroy the prince's claim, helped pave the path to Richard's throne. But now he too seemed uneasy. Did he know something? Or did he hear what no one dared say aloud, that the tower, once a fortress, had become a tomb with no markers? The princes stopped appearing. The courtyard remained empty, no footsteps, no laughter. Their rooms, still guarded, were darker now. Curtains drawn, lamps dimmed, servants reassigned. No one had seen them, no one had spoken to them, and the king, their uncle, said nothing, but the tower remembered. It always does. And as the city moved on, something inside those stone walls remained frozen. Soon, people would stop asking questions, not because they had answers, but because they had fear. And after the last rumor faded, there was only one truth left. The princes had disappeared, without struggle, without witnesses, without a trace. Disappearance is louder than death when it leaves nobody to mourn. The two boys, once heirs, now shadows, had vanished not with swords but with silence. Not a drop of blood, not a scream in the night. Just 2 rooms in the tower, empty. 2 names no longer spoken aloud, and 2 sons of a king reduced to myth before they reached manhood. There were whispers. A servant glimpsed pale figures behind a slit window. A guard said he heard soft voices, too soft for ghosts, too distant for prisoners. But when pressed, no one could recall exactly when they last saw Edward alive, or Richard, only that it had been some time ago. Long enough for doubt to grow, long enough for fear to spread like rot beneath the crown. In private, some still believed the boys were alive, that Richard III had them hidden, fed, preserved as hostages against future rebellion. But if that were true, why the darkness? Why the drawn curtains, the reassigned wardens, the deafening quiet from within those cold corridors? Why the unmarked passage of time? Others whispered of poison, of smothering, of daggers pressed against young throats in the dead of night. But no one could prove it. There were no cries, no broken doors, no stains left behind. Whoever did it, if it was done at all, knew how to kill without leaving a wound. Knew that sometimes absence is the sharpest blade. Still, something lingered. In the tower's stairwells, the air turned colder. Visitors avoided certain chambers. Guards rotated more frequently, as if the building itself wanted to forget what it had swallowed, or feared what it might one day cough back up. And yet, outside those walls, the throne held steady beneath Richard. His rule pressed forward, his enemies silenced, his crown unchallenged. But the question remained, heavy as stone, who had the will and the access to make two royal children vanish without trace? And more terrifying still, why had no one ever tried to bring them back? A crime without a body demands a killer without a face. And in the deathless silence of the tower, suspicion grew like ivy, slow, coiling, impossible to uproot. No one saw who gave the order. No one found the blade. But someone had to make the decision. Two boys don't simply dissolve into stone. Richard III stood at the center of that storm. King, uncle, protector, he had motive, he had means. He had everything to gain from their disappearance and everything to lose if they lived. The timing was precise. The declarations of illegitimacy, the rapid coronation, the controlled stillness that followed. He ruled a kingdom sewn shut with fear, and not even the wind dared carry the princes' names. And yet, certainty slips. Richard issued no confession. No eyewitness stood before God or court. And the longer he reigned, the more carefully he distanced himself from the tower, almost as if he too feared what had happened there. Then came Buckingham. Once Richard's closest ally, the Duke of Buckingham had helped destroy the prince's claim, helped bend Parliament, helped terrify the court into obedience. But only months into Richard's reign, Buckingham turned. He rose in rebellion. He threatened to side with Henry Tudor. He demanded justice. Why did guilt drive him? Or something darker, knowledge? Was Buckingham the sword behind the silence, acting alone, acting prematurely, acting without permission? Or was he cleaning a mess Richard could not touch himself, and still other names hovered? Lord Stanley playing both sides, the Tower's constables easily bought, even Henry Tudor across the sea, who stood to gain most from a kingdom that had already devoured its heirs. Too many motives, too many hands, too many locked doors and vanished nights. Each theory led not to truth, but to another silence. The Tower remained mute, the throne remained full, and the bones of the princes remained missing, but not forever. Because years later, someone would dig too deep and find what may have been left behind. Secrets buried in haste never stay buried forever. In the summer of 1674, almost 2 centuries after the princes vanished, workers demolishing a staircase within the White Tower struck something soft beneath the stone, beneath the dust, beneath the silence. Bones small, twisted, 2 child-sized skeletons tangled together in a shallow, forgotten grave. There was no plaque, no coffin, no royal seal, only dust and silence. But the Tower remembered, and England remembered. Whispers rushed in to fill the void. It was them. It had to be them. Edward, Richard, the missing sons of a dead king. The bodies were moved, placed in an urn, given a royal burial in Westminster Abbey, far from the darkness where they were found. But there was no investigation, no confirmation, no reckoning. Not a single monarch dared ask, who buried these boys beneath a staircase like vermin, because to ask was to accuse. To test those bones was to test the bloodline of the crown itself. And the crown does not test its own foundations, not when they rest on a grave. And so, the bones were sealed in stone once more, buried not to honor, but to silence. England had found what it lost and chose to look away. The tower resumed its vigil, the whispers faded, but something was wrong. Even as the earth was closed over them, something stayed behind, something that did not sleep with the bones. Because no grave, no matter how hidden, can bury what was never truly mourned. And in the years that followed, the silence around those stairs began to take on a life of its own. A burial without truth only deepens the haunting. The princes had been hidden beneath stone for nearly 200 years, yet even after discovery, they remained unanswered. No trial, no confession, no closure. And across every century since, one question has loomed heavier than any crown. Why did no one ever speak? Richard III never acknowledged their fate. He ruled with precision, died with defiance, and left no admission carved into history. Henry Tudor, who took the throne after Richard's fall, said even less. He married their sister, built a dynasty, and swept the prince's memory beneath layers of propaganda and peace. But peace paid for with silence is not peace at all. It is fear frozen in ceremony. The council said nothing. The guards who watched their doors said nothing. Those who whispered in corridors lowered their voices until even the ghosts couldn't hear them. And perhaps that was the point. The kingdom did not forget the princes, it chose to forget them. To speak of their murder would demand justice. And justice, in this case, meant war, meant naming traitors, meant opening the vaults of royal blood and finding poison inside. The realm had chosen stability over truth, and the price for that was eternal quiet. But the tower heard it all. Its walls absorbed every whisper, every lie, every name never spoken aloud. It is not just a fortress, it is a vault of guilt. And guilt, no matter how deep, does not decay. It lingers, it presses against the stone, it waits. And those who have walked the tower since, some swear it still breathes. Some ghosts do not scream, they walk. And in the Tower of London, where screams once echoed from traitors and queens, it is not the tortured who haunt the stone. It is two boys, silent, pale, walking hand in hand through corridors no guard dares patrol after nightfall. They do not beg, they do not weep. They simply move through locked doors, across forgotten stairwells, always together, always barefoot, always dressed in white. Those who have seen them never speak twice, because the horror is not in the apparition, it's in the realization that the tower never let them leave. Centuries have passed, kings have come and gone, thrones have cracked and reformed. But Edward and Richard remain, not as legends, not as lies, but as wounds the kingdom refused to close. Their faces, once painted in royal portraits, now flicker in candlelight beneath vaults no priest dares bless. The tower keeps its promises, it guards its secrets, and it remembers its dead, but it remembers those who were never buried more fiercely. And maybe that is why, even now, the truth feels further away than ever. Because the story of the princes in the tower was never about who killed them. It was about who chose to live as if they hadn't. No trial, no body, no grave with a name. The princes in the tower were never buried with justice, only with silence. And that silence became tradition. Monarchs changed, dynasties rose, but no king ever dared to dig for the truth. Because some crowns are built on missing bones, and some ghosts refuse to be forgotten. But if you think this is the darkest end a royal child can meet, then witness the final hours of Conradin, the teenage prince who was paraded through the streets and beheaded like a traitor for nothing more than being born into the wrong bloodline. Or watch The Black Dinner, where two noble boys were invited to a feast and left without their heads. Subscribe to Tortures of the Crown for more stories that history tried to erase, royal, brutal, and haunting to the end. And if you dare, join us in the next episode, where another crown will fall.